He is currently a visiting professor at Ashoka University on the border of Delhi, and chair of the Ashoka Center for China Studies. He was previously National Security Advisor to the Prime Minister of India, 2010, 2014, Foreign Secretary of India, 2006, 2009, and served as the Indian Ambassador of High Commissioner to China, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, and Israel, where I initially met him, and I had the pleasure of working with him. And since then, I developed a keen interest in India. And this is true of JISS today. We have very good relations with our counterparts in India. In 2016, he published, Ambassador Menon published Choices Inside the Making of Indian Foreign Policy. His book on India and Asian geopolitics, the past, present, was released in 2021. He has been a Fisher Family Fellow at the Kennedy School at Harvard University, a Fellow at MIT in 2015, and he was chosen one of the top 100 global thinkers by Foreign Policy magazine in 2010. He's also a distinguished fellow of the Center of Social and Economic Progress in India, former Brookings India, and a distinguished visiting research fellow at the National University of Singapore, and a member board of trustees of the International Crisis Group. May I ask them on this occasion to try, to influence this group to be more lenient toward Israel. And he will speak today about India's role in global order. And if at the end of the meeting you have any questions, please use the chat function, and I will transmit the questions to our speaker. Ambassador Menon, it's your floor.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Inba. It's a real pleasure, and I'm grateful to you for asking me to speak to JISS. We've known each other for a long time, and you'd suggested that I speak on India's role in the global order. I feel like a bit of a fraud speaking about this because, quite frankly, my views on world order are maybe slightly different from what most people believe. So what I thought I'd do was speak for about 30 minutes first on the way I see the global order, India's foreign policy, and then about India's role in it, and then open it up to a discussion because I'd be very interested to hear what you think. When we look around the world today, quite frankly, for me, this is not a world where there is either a rule-based liberal international order or a global order or a world order of any particular kind. I would rather call this today a world between orders, a world, more accurately, a world adrift, because for several reasons. I mean, world orders are a historical anomaly. They are a result of completely skewed distributions of power in favor of one power, as in the 13th century in favor of the Mongols, or post-World War II in favor of the USA. Today, when you look at power, it's much more evenly distributed, but there's also a disjuncture. If economic power is really multipolar, there are at least three large economic areas of the world. I mean, there's the US or North America, and NAFTA, USMCA, there's the EU or Europe, and there's RCP in the area around China, each of which. But if you look at the world in terms of military power, it's still unipolar. There's still only one country which can project military force where it wants, when it wants around the globe, and that's the US of A. Politically, the world is confused. And in fact, that's where both the opportunity and the challenge lies, in the politics of this world. So, and why do I call this a world adrift? When was the last time we saw a coherent international response to a transnational challenge? To my mind, April 2009, the London G20, when we managed to prevent a Great Depression and stabilize the world economy after the global financial crisis of 2008. Since then, look at the response to climate change, to the pandemic, the COVID pandemic, and pathetic, quite frankly. People like to say, oh, we're in a multipolar world, or it's moving towards multipolarity. Leaders like to say this. It flatters them to think of themselves as a pole, present or future. But frankly, it's misleading. It doesn't describe the way power is actually distributed, the real balance of power. And today what we're seeing is accelerated shifts in the balance of power, accelerated by technology. And we've seen this in the last 30 years. We've seen the rise of China. We've seen the reactions from established powers to that rise. China-US rivalry, the pushback. We've seen China's maritime neighbors, in fact, all across that arc, working much more closely together than they ever have before in defense and security and intelligence. And we see great power rivalry wherever we look. You look in Europe with Russia, you look in maritime Asia, and contention, quite frankly, is intrinsic to a system of sovereign states. So today, therefore, we have in this world between orders, we really have geopolitical fragmentation. It's an interesting problem. The world is more connected economically than ever before, but it's undergoing geopolitical fragmentation. So you can see that there are regional balances, each of which is shifting very rapidly. You see it around you in West Asia. But unlike history, where, yes, for most of history, the world consisted of multiverses, of each little universe which took care of itself. West Asia, the Indian Ocean region centered on India, a Sinic world in East Asia, for instance. But in those days, they traded with each other, they exchanged ideas, even religion, but they were not part of each other's security and political calculus. Today, they are, because of technology, because of the nature of the economic links, thanks to globalization. So local conflicts, like Ukraine, which is primarily a quarrel between Europeans about European order, has global effects, whether it's in terms of energy, food prices. So geopolitical contention has become local in the seas near China, in Northeast Asia, with the nuclearization of North Korea, in the Indian Ocean or the Indo-Pacific, and the same in West Asia. Center of gravity, of course, of geopolitical contention is primarily in maritime Asia, where the center of gravity of the world's geopolitics has followed the economics. If you look at the share in world GDP of the various parts of the world, frankly, while the US share has stayed roughly the same from 1980 until just before COVID, around 25, 26%, China's share has grown all the way up to almost 18%. India's around 9%, 8 to 9%. And Europe's share has dropped considerably, down to about 19%. And the sources of growth in the world economy are also now in the Indo-Pacific, in maritime Asia, rather than elsewhere. So we are therefore dealing with a fragmented and uncertain world, which is not very orderly. So the means to cope with issues in this are also therefore ad hoc, tentative, impermanent. I have a mantra that I use, which is of issue-based coalitions of the willing and the able. And this depends on the issue. You'll find a different set of partners to work with. And when you look at the Quad, you look at the I2U2, you look at AUKUS, you look at many of those organizations which are being formed, you look at what was being done with the Abraham Accords, for instance, you see much more initiative today by local powers and by a host of local powers, by Israel itself, by Saudi Arabia, by Iran. And today there are balancing, hedging, other options for independent action which didn't exist in the Cold War or in the unipolar moment when China and the US worked closely together. So this is now an era of coalitions, but of shifting coalitions rather than of alliances, of what I would say is unalignment, not non-alignment, because it's not a bipolar world where you can be non-aligned between two blocks. And that's why for me, this is a world, as I said, between orders. It's really returned to its normal state for most of history, the absence of the world order. It's just that we've got so used to, thanks to the Cold War and to the situation for almost 70 years after that, that we've got so used to thinking in terms of a global order. If we need a historical analogy, the closest I can think of really is late 19th century Europe, when you had multiple powers at different levels of development and power, contending for mastery and seeing threats everywhere. And of course, that didn't end very well, but I hope we have better sense now. What about India? What is India's interest in this, and how has India seen its role in this kind of world now? For India, you know, there's been strategic consistency to Indian foreign policy for a very simple reason. When India became independent in 1947, average life expectancy was about 26 years. 14% of the population was literate. The Indian economy had not grown for the last 50 years. From 1900 to 1947, there was only 0.05% growth in the Indian economy. And 200 years of colonialism had really reduced one of the world's richest and originally advanced economies to one of the poorest and most backward. It couldn't feed itself, disease, famine, you name it. So it was clear that the transformation of India had to be the goal. And this was agreed across the board, whether people differed on how to do it, whether they were from the extreme right or the communists. But the goal was quite clear, transform India. So the function of foreign policy became to enable the transformation of India. Not status, not glory, not revenge for history, none of this. Just transforming India became the overriding goal. That's a very different goal from most other countries who have much more complicated goals. And at each stage of the three big phase transformations in the international situation since 1947, India's adjusted her role, her tactics in her own way, but that goal has stayed the same, the transformation of India into a modern, prosperous, secure society where every Indian can achieve their full potential. When at independence and soon thereafter, when the world was divided into two blocks, into the bipolar Cold War, a weak, newly independent India chose pretty bravely not to join either bloc and to go her own way, what was called non-alignment. Dulles thought this was immoral. He thought we were trying to get the best out of both. Maybe we were, maybe we weren't. But anyway, that's what India chose rather than alignment or joining one side or the other. When, after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, the unipolar moment began, India began transforming her relationships across the board into a much more open, multi-directional foreign policy, whether it was with the USA, where we began the process of transforming the relationship and have since actually brought it to a remarkable level, short of a mutual defense commitment. We do most of what alliance partners do in the world today. We open the embassy in Israel, for instance. We opened an office in Taiwan, and we really started a Look East policy, which concentrated on Japan, on Vietnam, on ASEAN, and so on. We're now in the third phase, and I described to you how I see this world between orders that we're in. For me, this situation for India certainly has opened opportunities. One of the big beneficiaries of this is India-US relations. But that's partly also because from the US side, with heightened US-China rivalry, they see utility in the rest of Asia and work much more closely. And given the difficult nature of the relationship that India has with China, it's clear that India also would therefore work much more closely with the US. But it also, this situation that I described, also throws up its own challenges for India. South Asia, the Indian Ocean region are no longer a geopolitical backwater. During the Cold War, the main fault line, Fulda, was in Europe between the Soviet Union and the US. South Asia was a backwater, could actually go its own way, do what it wanted. No longer. Now that the center of gravity of world economics, of geopolitics, is in our neighborhood, and the main rivalry is between China and the US, we get dragged into it whether we like it or not. And so you see powers in Asia, east of India, Japan, Australia, South Korea, Singapore, and the others, all reorienting their policies. The normal reaction is to hedge, keeping relations with both China and the US, and to simultaneously balance by building up their own military strength and options. And this has been done by long-term US allies like Japan, like Korea, by strengthening, and the Philippines by strengthening their alliances with the US. Australia's done AUKUS and will be getting nuclear submarines now. For others like India and Vietnam, which were not traditionally part of the alliance system, it's done by strengthening their military and security coordination with the US. And coordinated Indian and US action even in West Asia for the first time through I2U2, and the development of a role for India and US strategy. And you look at the instruments, the Quad, an Indo-Pacific strategy, the Indo-Pacific Economic Forum. These are all part of a rebalancing in maritime Asia and in the Rimland to counterbalance actually the consolidation of the Eurasian landmass by an informal coalition of China, Russia, and Iran. And what we see, therefore, is a shifting balance of power as a result of those 3 decades of very rapid growth in Asia. On the one, as I said, on the one hand, we're all part of one global economic system. And the frameworks of economic cooperation, at least, in Asia, east of India, are open, not closed as they were during the Cold War or the unipolar moment. Quad, the IPEF, the RCP, CPTPP, these are all open arrangements. But the question is really this fragmentation of geopolitics, this confusion in politics itself, it leaves the international system incapable of dealing with the real big challenges of the day, whether it is keeping the global economy open and back to the glory days of the globalization years when growth was much easier and much faster without the protectionism that we see today, whether it's climate change, whether it's serious threats to peace like terrorism, where we sit beside Pakistan and the Taliban-ruled Afghanistan are still serious. And of course, issues of China's trajectory and behavior. So what does that mean? If you see the world like this, what does that mean for India's role in this global order or lack of it? You know, traditional IR theories, all these categories, swing state, balancer, middle power, these really are no longer accurate, or frankly, they don't express the complexity of India's engagements and challenges. India today is a state which has, as a result of, frankly, accelerated growth over 35 years of over 7% growth in the economy, has managed to pull something like 380 million people out of poverty, has built a certain capacity, the world's 5th largest economy, has some economic heft. We see that in the global rice markets and so on. It's also, I mean, just before COVID, it was accounting for 15 to 17% of economic growth in the world economy. And it offers opportunities in terms of the market and technology, services. has a certain preponderance in its immediate periphery, but it also has limitations. So it's a transitional power. Limitations in terms of, in its own periphery, it shares with China, and with a China that is increasingly assertive over time. It has limitations, you know them, in terms of its defense industry, for instance. It needs to work with friends, and Israel has been a friend for a very long time. But it needs to work with friends in order to create that enabling environment externally for India's transformation. But the success of India's growth and the changes in India have actually led to considerable discussion and multiple views within India on what kind of role India should play abroad. The traditional answer since independence across governments, as I said, was to concentrate on India's own development. And this opened India to accusations of being a freeloader on the international system, of not pulling her weight, and so on. Indira Gandhi used to keep saying India will be a different kind of power. And she had her reasons. It's hard to think of another power with the same weight, the same internal preoccupations at similar levels of development, and with the kind of geography that India has. So there is a basis for Indian exceptionalism. But history and experience, and certainly the last 30 years, showed that India does best when she's more engaged with the world. And it's those portions of India which are most linked to the outside world, which have always done best. Post-1991, the opening of the economy have really been the best years. And that needs partners. That needs India to work with partners. But now that India has achieved a certain success and some capabilities, this $3 trillion economy, some Indians, especially the new middle class, they want a larger role. It's popular among this middle class who read books like Why is India Not a Great Power? Modi addresses this by speaking of India as a potential Vishwaguru or world teacher, and of India playing a much larger role. And this shift in rhetoric actually plays well at home. But when it comes to actual behavior, there is probably more continuity than change in India's international role. And if you look at it, I mean, there is a tactical caution in the way India engages, while there's strategic boldness. After all, it took a lot of courage to be non-aligned at the height of the Cold War. And even now, if you look at what India's reaction to issues like the Ukraine war and so on, it's a pretty unique Indian reaction. For me, the best predictor of the Indian role is really to look at Indian interests across governments, and to see, and I think that is probably the best way of defining the kind of role that India is likely to play, and India's choices, if you don't want to be surprised by them. Obviously, like all states, have territorial integrity and so on, but there is no existential threat to India today. So when you start the hierarchy of interests, I mean, you'd start with the peaceful periphery, and that would include not just South Asia. There are two things, though, that could fundamentally affect that external environment. And one of them is, of course, energy security, because India is energy poor and has always been a major importer of energy. The other is climate change. We are really threatened. So if you look at India's stance on climate change, it has moved to being much more activist, forming the International Solar Alliance, for instance, undertaking voluntary commitments to decarbonize and so on, and playing a much more active role in international negotiations from an initially defensive and reactive stance to a much more proactive one. But the search for partners, of course, extends much beyond that. Traditionally, India has found partners in the global south, which is increasingly important, and which in a world like, as I described, between orders, actually finds more space. People keep talking about India leading the global south. Frankly, nobody elected us leader, and nobody wants leaders in the global south, especially with their history of colonialism and so on. They're especially sensitive to this. Besides, this is not the bipolar world, which enabled non-alignment, non-aligned movement. In a globalized economy, developing countries are at different levels of development. So the global south includes a whole variety of interests. So this is no block in the making. But what is clear is most of them do not want to be dragged into choosing sides in great power rivalries. And we saw this very clearly with Ukraine, when the war started in Ukraine. But certainly, India works with others to build issue-based coalitions. Now, whether, as I mentioned, what we're doing with Israel in West Asia, what we do in the Quad, in the Indo-Pacific, BRICS, for instance, which has just agreed earlier today to expand to include the UAE, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Ethiopia, and Argentina. But these are not exclusive. They don't prevent one from working with each of these groups, depending on where it's useful. On the biggest world order issues, India, unlike China, is not seeking to overthrow the present order. It's only seeking to recast and improve it, to reflect present realities and address present concerns. When we look at India's main concerns today, the US is on the side of those who help rather than hinder the attainment of Indian interests, whether it's India's self-strengthening. The US has, since 2005, been a strong supporter of India's has helped in maintaining peaceful periphery. And the US works with India in our periphery in the Indian Ocean, increasingly on issues like maritime security, and even on the transnational challenges. Things have. So it's interesting. While on climate change, for instance, the US approach in the Inflation Reduction Act of an industrial policy, in effect, would create capacity and make renewable energy cheaper, and would create economic opportunity for countries like India, unlike the protectionist EU approach of a carbon tax at their border, which would prevent. So we see an increasing congruence, not only in security terms and in strategic terms between India and the US, which we've built on to transform the relationship, but increasingly even on the other issues, on technology, for instance, on internet governance, a multi-stakeholder approach suits us better. On counterterrorism, maritime security, several other issues, we have very strong congruence. So for India today, the Western order led by the US seems more conducive to developing India than the alternatives, which are still vague and worrying. So what I would anticipate, and if I had to summarize India's role in the order today, in this kind of order, I would say you'd see increasingly engaged strategic autonomy. As India's capabilities increase, she will seek an expanded role, but that role would still be driven primarily by the transformation of India and would therefore be unique given our circumstances. I'll stop there, and I'd be happy to answer any questions you might have, but I'd be interested in hearing what you think.
Ambassador Menon, the first question is about your, conceptual historic view of this period as being the end of the 19th century. This period ended up in World War I.
Yes, it didn't end well.
So do you foresee a similar ending to this inter-period
Not
And,
really.
where will it take place?
Not really. I think, well, it depends. I think in all these cases, you ended up in disaster because somebody or several people thought they would win. And everybody thought home by Christmas was in 1914. Both sides were saying home by Christmas. Today, if you look at the actual distribution of power, I think people are more realistic. Often, where's the risk? The risk is China-US. The Chinese are following every US sanction on Ukraine, on Russia, in practice. They might say what they like, but they know which side their bread is buttered on. And this is true of the entire global South. We all talk a good fight. We talk an independent fight. We refuse to choose sides politically. But if you look at what we do economically, nobody's breaking those sanctions, except a few rogue states, and they get slapped down pretty easily. They're found out quite quickly. So, and for me, there's still hope here. If you look at the behavior of the great powers, I think because of the nature of globalization, because of the nature of technology, because I think information is much better today. So the kind of miscalculation or the kind of getting locked into a Schlieffen plan, this kind of thing, I think, is much less likely today. So whichever your explanations for the disaster of 1914, and there are different explanations, but you can actually find answers in today's situation, which makes you a little more optimistic. So I think we're clever enough. But so I'm not so frightened about direct great power conflict. Look at Ukraine. It's actually an example of how superpowers or great powers are managing to stay out of direct confrontation while kicking each other under the table in every which way they can. But what worries me is their ability to actually control local conflict and to prevent civil wars, to deal with issues, is much lower than it has been ever since World War II. And so it's the risks, the uncertainty is high. And second thing that worries me is that their domestic politics has to let them be reasonable. And that I can't predict. And especially for both the biggest economies in the world, I mean, for both China and the US. I'm not willing to take bets of what's going to happen. So that's a yes and no answer, actually. But I don't think the analogy is perfect. I just, maybe I shouldn't have, because I don't want people to think I think the war is inevitable. No, not at all.
Of course, that's my reaction. You omitted the human factor. There was a big miscalculation in 1914, and probably this can be repeated.
This is the problem. You can't underestimate human folly. I mean, people make mistakes. And yeah, that's the worrying part.
Yeah, we all read Barbara Tuchman, March of August.
Exactly, yeah. But, I mean, like people say, what about Taiwan? It's really dangerous. Actually, they've all managed Taiwan so far without actually getting into. And as long as neither side is confident that they will win, because neither side can afford to lose. So, and it would be politically disastrous or suicide if they lost. So somebody has to feel he's sure he'll win. And today, neither side is confident. As long as that's the case, I breathe a sigh of relief. But as you said, you can't, there's no predicting.
Somebody from our audience who I don't know personally, Graham Davis, asks you, do you envisage the recreation of a theater and the policy of collective defense to balance Chinese, emerging power in the Indo-Pacific?
Unlikely, because it's an interesting phenomenon. Over the last decade and a half, all of China's maritime neighbors have intensified their defense, intelligence, security cooperation, whether it's Japan, Australia, Vietnam, Singapore, Indonesia, India. And yet each of us has such broad and deep economic ties with China that none of us is actually in a position to treat China as an enemy country. So long as, so the preference is certainly among ASEAN seems to be to have an American-led security order and a Chinese-led economic order, both at the same time. So what do you see? You see the same state, and this should theoretically be impossible, but they are hedging, the balancing, the bandwagoning, all at the same time. It looks completely contradictory, but this is not the behavior of a solid alliance. So I'm not sure that we're heading in that direction at all. This is why I call this an unaligned world, where you get issue-based coalitions of the willing, rather than, one formal alliance structure. And Asia has never managed that. Even Seattle and CENTO were they never developed the way NATO did. And the common purpose or even the interoperability that you got in Europe. Today, it's interesting. You have levels of interoperability between India and the US, which you've never known before, and we've never had with anybody before. But we have no alliance. And if you ask either of us, we say, no, we're not allies, we're partners. It's an interesting phenomenon. So I think it's more complicated than just the structures or the forms. I think we need to watch what people do rather than what they say, more than.
Another question from Barry Weinstein, who is affiliated with JISS and sitting on the west coast of America. Do you see India actively pursuing the development of a trade route from India through UAE, Saudi Arabia to Israel, the I2, U2? How do you evaluate this?
We've actually been talking about it, and I think, yes, I can see this increasingly as a possibility. And I'm very glad that we're actually serious about this. My only fear is that West Asian politics itself seems shifting. I mean, you have to tell me, you know this much better than I do. And a lot of this is going to require long-term investments and long-term efforts too. So it's going to be interesting. But for things like, high value and essential things, and among this I would include energy and defense and so on. Yes, I can see this becoming reality.
Is this alternative to the BRI?
No, and I don't think we should get into that game. We should do what's in our interest, rather than say, I will match what somebody else is doing. I mean, BRI, frankly, will stand or fall on its own merits. And right now, I mean, it's been already revised and redone twice since it started as one belt, one road. So I'd like to see where it goes. I think that's a lot of money that China has extended, and not all those projects are going to pay back. So let's see how this works. There are those who say that if you owe the bank enough money, you own the bank. Maybe, I don't know, but that's not a great hope for geopolitics, and that's not a great way to handle the future. But I don't think we should get into that game at all. We should be doing what's in our interest.
I hope one day I'll be facing the dilemma to have so much money in one bank. Another question, from probably an Indian person, Vivek Mishra, Indian name. How is the inclusion of 6 more members in BRICS likely to reshape the global South order? Is it likely to bring advantages or disadvantages to India?
Well, I think it strengthens BRICS to the extent that the new development bank, which BRICS set up, 2 of the members have already pledged capital, Egypt, UAE. Some of the work that BRICS is trying to do on the economic side, I think, will be much more effective as a result. But, there's always been a difference within BRICS on the politics of BRICS. While Russia and China have seen it as a useful and counterweight to the Western order. Brazil, South Africa traditionally, and India have seen it as primarily an economic organization. China stayed clear, actually, of many of, I mean, Xi Jinping's speech didn't include his global development initiative, his global security initiative. He brought some of those ideas into BRICS and wanted people to work on them. But he wasn't pushing a Chinese order. And it's interesting. I think as BRICS gets more representative in the sense that more countries join it, you'll get more opinions, you'll get more interest. And in some ways, it'll soften this problem. I think it'll be more difficult for it to be seen as an anti-Western bloc or for anyone to turn it into one, which it hasn't been so far. And so far, I think we've been successful in avoiding that. And in concentrating on its primary job, which is development among the members.
This is, another question also about BRICS from Mindy Stein, one of our supporters in the United States. The BRICS countries are trying to replace the American currency, which can affect the strength of the American dollar, to apply sanctions and preserve world order. So there is a mixed message about it.
I didn't see anything about replacing the currency this time in what they put out, in the material I've seen so far. Maybe there's more stuff coming out. I know that Lula of Brazil has been speaking about it, and Russia, of course, welcomes the idea since she can't use US currencies. If you look at the interest of most of us keep our reserves as a store of value. Where else do you go? Where does China keep her reserves? I mean, it's still around 80% in US treasuries after all these years and despite their relationship. So I think we need to distinguish. I think what US sanctions and the expropriation of Russian reserves have done is they've tempted other people to look for alternate means of payment, of settling accounts. That, I think, is possible. People will settle accounts in bilateral currencies or other ways. But as a store of value, it's hard to see an alternative to the US dollar in the world economy. So I'm not really sure. So you might see currency arrangements, payment arrangements between countries. Russia has been asking for Chinese yuan in payment for oil exports. But I'm not sure. And that, I think, is a natural hedging reaction against what they saw as the expropriation of reserves and as the use of Sprint as an economic weapon. So I think that you might see, but as a store of value, most people have an interest in the dollar staying where it is and not losing or not being replaced. So I think that's another good case of we need to watch what people do rather than the rhetoric.
JISS definitely has an interesting and strong dollar because most of our money comes from dollars. Another question from Dr. Oshrit Birvatker, that is our India expert. And with Russia now facing a serious crisis and getting closer to China as a junior partner, New Delhi is perhaps confronting one of the most serious shifts in its strategic environment since the end of the Cold War. Are you concerned about the new alliance or closer relations between Moscow and Beijing?
Yes and no, up to a point. If you notice, well, Russia has been in secular decline for some time, for many years. If you look at our demography, you look at the economy, you look at, we have been reducing or trying to reduce our dependence on Russian defense supplies from the mid-2000s. I mean, if you compare 2006, almost 80% of our defense imports used to come from Russia. We're now below 30%, and that's even though most of this is maintenance imports for old platforms and spares and so on. So our dependence tremendously. Certainly, it makes our life much harder on continental Asia when you see Russia acting as a junior partner to China. But at the same time, I think there are also limits to that, to how far they will work together. And we have to see, if you look at Central Asia, for instance, it's an interesting arena, I think, to see the limits of Chinese power and also Russian discomfort with what's happening. The Chinese attempt, of course, will be to work with Russia to push at the open door in Eurasia and try and consolidate the entire landmass. And to the extent that Iran, Russia see no alternatives, yes, they will work with China and make that possible. But my own sense is that there is only so much that the Russo-Chinese alliance can do for its members. Russia can't do very much for China's main preoccupations, which are the US and Taiwan and her periphery and the contention in her maritime periphery. Russia is not a presence there, in either politically or militarily or China can't do for her main, which is European order, Ukraine, and again, Russia-US relations. So this is an alliance of animus against the West, rather than an alliance which is based on a congruence of interest and ability to help each other on their main priorities. So I think we need to take that into account when we start assessing the impact of this alliance.
Another question from Daniel Carmon, our former ambassador to India. And by the way, also the boss of my daughter, when she served for 2 years at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, he was an excellent boss. The question is whether Israel has to worry about Iran joining BRICS. You know, and this is giving maybe greater legitimacy to Iran in the international arena.
I'm not sure that. Well, good to hear from you, Daniel, and good to know that you're active. But it seems to me that if Iran sees other avenues for her activities, in fact, she's looking for options. And this, for me, is one way of actually releasing some of her energy in a more positive direction than leaving her completely dependent on Russia, China. And so let's see. I think we're watching an interesting phase in Iranian diplomacy, at least this so-called softening towards Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and the others. I think we have to watch this very carefully. I wouldn't jump to conclusions yet. I'd be careful.
There is a question about...
I'd like to ask you the same question, actually.
About Iran?
What is she doing?
I think that any inclusion of Iran in an international organization is against our effort to isolate Iran in the international arena because of its intention to destroy the Jewish state and its nuclear program. So we are obviously not happy about it. And,
but you think an isolated Iran will behave better?
This is part of the Western strategy, sanctions. As far as I'm concerned, you probably know that I have a more muscular view about the situation.
Yeah.
So, but this is obviously, from our point of view, not a good step of international actors. Yeah, very problematic from our point of view. So there's another question about your lessons from Ukraine, where the Russian army didn't do very well, and will you continue to rely on Russian weaponry? Of course, it's not full reliance, as we all know, but So, any thoughts in India?
I think we started cutting our reliance, as I said, long before Ukraine.
Yeah, of course.
I'm sure our military people will draw their own conclusions about, but the whole Russian system, I mean, it's a conscript army, the way they ran the war, this is very different from anything that we have ever known or planned or made our own. In fact, it's quite amazing how little we actually borrowed from the Russians in terms of doctrine and the ways, and any of the ways we actually ran our armies. Equipment, yes, because it was cheap. It seemed indestructible at one stage, and it seemed to work. But even that has now diminished considerably. That, as I said, the dependence on this. So I'm not sure that Ukraine will change that. We'll draw other lessons, obviously, from what we see. Some of the, I think the problem is every 2-3 years we hear of a new revolution in military affairs, and then every 3 years we then hear how that was all wrong. This was supposed to be a quick war, all technology, this, that, I mean, we're back to, it looks like the First World War, some parts of it. It's so, but I'll leave that to the professionals. They know what they're seeing. And I think it's probably still too early to say where it's going to end. So, but politically, this really looks bad because it doesn't look as though whatever happens, that we're going to end up with a very satisfactory or stable situation. Whatever happens militarily.
Another question is about, concerning the BJP ascendance in Indian domestic politics. To what extent has religion influenced foreign policy? I visited last time Vivekananda, and there were, nuances which I didn't know about.
Well, India's always been a very religious society. And the other example I like to give is the US is a very religious society too. If you think of it at the individual personal level and in terms of piety and in terms of the, does it affect foreign policy? So far, it's hard to see because Hinduism hasn't been a proselytizing religion. There isn't an alternative sort of Hindu worldview on which to base a foreign policy. And unlike other religions, I mean, especially proselytizing religions, it doesn't have a history of mixing the politics and religion together. So I think people are trying to feel how to deal with this, today, if you look at it. But it's hard to speak of a Hindu foreign policy today in India. And Hinduism is still a subcontinental religion. It's not a global religion. To the extent that it binds a diaspora, yes, but that's cultural more than, I would say, religion. I mean, religion as part of the culture rather than. So I'm not sure that it's started affecting foreign policy yet. It might, in the future. It depends, on the choices people make. But I don't see, Ukraine happens. I mean, how does Hinduism enter your calculus?
It's a yoga. The next question is about, your perspective on Ukraine, defining it as a local conflict. It pits, two superpowers, Russia and the United States, and this is not my question. We actually emulate your policy on Ukraine.
I'm not sure who's following whom, because you were first, actually.
Maybe, I don't know.
You were trying
but,
to, yeah, if you look at the timing.
Great minds think the same.
Right, yes.
So, but it's not local. It consumes energies of NATO, of the United States.
Yeah, I said it has huge second-order effects. But primarily, what's the quarrel? The quarrel is about European order. Russians don't like the order that emerged after the end of the Cold War. There was a European order which both sides respected, even during the Cold War, when they had basically partitioned Europe, and when the Americans let them do what they wanted in Hungary in '56 and Poland, etc., Czechoslovakia, and vice versa. I mean, they didn't. But since the end of the Cold War, the Russians don't like what's happened. And so they want to upset the order. So it's a fight about European order. But yes, I said it has global effects in today's globalized economy and in today's world with technology, with the way we are tied to each other. It does affect us all. I'm not denying that, but these are second-order effects. And frankly, that quarrel will go on because they can't sort Europe out, not because of what you and I do.
Yes.
And it's more than just because from my point of view, I mean, who is the mover in this? The mover is Russia at both stages. And in 2014, they did Crimea and nobody reacted. So then they do another invasion. Suddenly the whole world reacts. Whole world meaning the whole West reacts. So have the rules changed? Or has somebody seen an opportunity? I don't know what's going on here. But it's
No, there is an American expression: the bastards change the rule in the middle of the game.
Game, exactly. He shifted the goalposts. So for me, it's still primarily a European problem, which is, it affects us all. But ultimately, because it's politics, we will all find ways of dealing with it. And actually of using it to our own advantage.
I have a question. I'm not sure, it's an anonymous attendee. India is providing weapons to Armenia. How do you see this step in terms? I don't know if it's correct.
I don't know. I'm not part of government. I should have made clear at the beginning. I am not. Right, yes.
Okay, I think we are out of time. And I want to thank you very much for your willingness to teach us, to give your opinion about India, which is an important actor, from our point of view. And thank you very much. And I'll be happy to continue the conversation between us.
Look forward to that. Look forward very much to that.
Thank you very much, Ambassador.
Thank you. Good of you.
Thank you to our audience.